The next question is more of a philosophical question. What is the most beautiful thing about DNA when you think about it?
Well, to me, the most interesting and beautiful and fascinating thing is the information compaction that's there. And people don't really think about that. People, often talk about the DNA code. One way to think about it, if anybody in the audience knows about artificial intelligence and large language models, and how they compact information into just a few gigabytes. I mean, DNA is only a few gigabytes. It's like 3 billion base pairs. 3 billion individual letters does not explain this.
Everything, yeah.
In terms of the linear sequence. So the way you have to think about it is that the DNA in the egg serves a different purpose than the DNA in a nerve cell or the DNA in the heart cell. It has all the information there. As the DNA replicates in the different cells that it becomes, it actually assumes a different function or set of functions in each cell. The way I usually talk about it is, where is the gene for nest building in birds? Is there a gene for building a nest in birds? Because people often think of the gene for intelligence or the gene for this or that. Turns out there is no gene for nest building any more than there's a gene for me liking chocolate. Right? But what there is as the DNA is replicating, it is assuming a new environment. It's unzipping into a new environment using a computer terminology.
Right.
And it's expecting a certain environment. And then it divides again and again and again. And so what's happening is, eventually what is built in the bird's brain are different cells in just the right place at the right time, signaling in just the right way, that has the instinct for building one kind of nest versus another. And if you ever watched a nature documentary, you can see all the different styles of nest building that different birds will have. It's all built, but you have to reverse engineer the final structure of the bird's brain back to the DNA, and you can't find any one place. It's distributed across the genome, as it turns out, most likely in what's called an epigenetic state. So it's not just the linear sequence of the DNA, it's the three-dimensional information of the DNA that actually has a code in it that we've yet to decipher.
Could there be a deeper layer? Like maybe at the top layer you see the 3 billion codes, but this could be a deeper layer.
Absolutely. No, that's exactly what I'm saying, is that there's codes within codes within codes. The ability to understand that is actually, frankly, starting to become possible given the artificial intelligence programs that people are writing. So people have looked now, using these large language models, like OpenAI and GPT and other things, they've looked at the code and they find and see vast codes and programs that at prior levels of analysis we never saw before. And so that's only just starting to become available.
That reminds me of the movie or the book Contact, when the first level of information was first a prime number, right?
Yes.
And then it was the image, and then it was much more complex.
And that great part where the billionaire who's funding Jodie Foster's basically says to her, because they couldn't figure it out, because you're only thinking in 2D, but if you make it into a 3D, which is what epigenetics is, it's 3D, now you can basically see how all the pieces fit together.
Please tell us about your other inventions, the CyTOF and the quantum barcoding, which is, I understand, the more recent invention.
Okay, so CyTOF was born out of a limitation of an instrument called a fluorescence activated cell sorter. So Leonard Herzenberg at Stanford, professor there in the Department of Genetics, and his wife, Leonora Herzenberg, had sort of co-participated in the invention of the fluorescence activated cell sorter. They'd already developed this instrument, and it at the time could not only analyze proteins in cells, on cells I should say, with antibodies that bound to target proteins, and they had fluorophores on them. These are basically tags that you could use to read whether or not the antibody was there, and therefore infer that the protein was there because it was binding specifically to that protein. But they could only do 3 tags at a time when I was there. And when I left their lab to go to David Baltimore's lab, I think we were up to 5. And the instrument that I had used that could do 2 or 3 was ready to be delivered to the Smithsonian as part of their display and exhibit on biotechnology in Silicon Valley, right? So I actually signed up the last day to make sure that I was the last one to use it, and I wrote my name on the inside of the instrument. So 300 years from now, if we don't fall off a cliff, someone will say, who's this narcissist who wrote his name in here? So that limitation basically means you can only measure, let's say, 4 or 5 things at a time. And even after 15 years, they'd only pushed the number up to maybe around 10. And meanwhile, I was interested in the immune system, and there's 100 different kinds of cells. So you need more than 10 markers to look at the majority of the cells in the immune system. And so I had been searching in the early 2000s for other ways to create tags. It turned out by pure happenstance and luck that there had been this guy by the name of Scott Tanner, who was a professor at the University of Toronto, who'd been emailing me saying, I have this thing. And I was like, who is this guy? So by luck, I was in Toronto at a conference, and I was interviewing literally this. I remember seeing this guy across the room who saw me and then made a beeline for me, and I'm like, oh God, who's this? And it was this guy, Scott Tanner, who would not let me leave until he explained to me what he had. And so I called Sean over, and we listened to what he had to say, and then I realized, okay, I get it. If what this guy has is right, and it's doing what he says it can do, then this is the game changer I've been looking for.
It's fascinating.
And so we developed a collaboration. We took it to the next level. And then because of my connections in Silicon Valley with venture firms, I got funding for Scott to create a company called DVS Sciences. We got $10 million, and then later sold the company for $207 million.
It's a nice investment.
And but what we'd done was we had created a tool that suddenly could do 50 parameters, which was such a step up, being more than tenfold, and it has to do with the complexity of how the numbers work. It allowed us to look and survey the whole immune system. We published a landmark paper in Science, not only showing what the technology could do, but then also developing algorithms, computer programs for dealing with the data. And that ended up being, in I think 2012, Nature Invention of the Year. Wow. And so one of the limitations there was...
This is the CyTOF we're talking about.
The CyTOF.
Yeah.
Was 50 is nice, but it's not... I mean, scientists always want more. And so around that time came up with this idea of how to use a process called split pool, which is, again, just something that's been in the literature for a while, to put it together with single-cell analysis so that we could measure millions of events. Or at the very least thousands or tens of thousands. The only limitation is not that we can't measure millions of things. It's that at the time, the costs of measuring a million things would be the whole NIH budget, right? Which you can't do. So we, set the bar a little lower. We wrote patents. We went and did some of the proof of concept. I raised money outside, proved it the case. Sold the company to Roche, spun it out again as another company because they had, they satisfied themselves that it worked. They said, okay, but, our objectives have changed. So some venture firms had approached them and said, hey, this technology that Garry invented is foundational. We have some other inventors who have some tricks that they can add on top of that. Let's put together another company, and that's Scale. And Scale now has products. They can do some pretty remarkable stuff. They can not only use it for proteins, but they can use it for RNA, they can use it for epigenetic states in cells, et cetera. So, it took 12 years to get it to this point. I've had plenty of people tell me that ideas that I have will not work. And my response is usually, okay, well, if you don't see the future I see, I'm not going to sit here and argue with you all day. I'm just going to go back to the laboratory and prove it. So that's, and that's usually what I tell students is, don't feel if you know you're right and you can see the steps to get there clearly, don't let somebody else dissuade you. Don't let them demoralize you. Just do it.
Yes. That's great advice. What keeps you motivated to do the work you do, to continue to do the research? What is the top element that keeps you going?
I hate seeing opportunity wasted. I get a kick out of seeing somebody else do things better and then get lost in the data, right? I want to give people so much data that they feel like they're swimming in a sea of opportunity themselves.
Speaking of that, you formed several companies, 2 of which are on NASDAQ. Maybe there's more going to be there. How do you have time to do your research that you do and at the same time run or create these companies?
I think you have to understand how it is that ideas flow from the laboratory to the commercial marketplace. Scientists are great at producing ideas. So you create an idea, but if you see value in that idea, the NIH is not going to fund it. They funded your basic research. They're not going to fund putting it into commercial. So they need another kind of risk taker. And that's where venture capital comes in, where if you can formulate your idea in the right way and show that there's a commercial possibility, they'll put in money so that they can make money for their investors, who end up being actually often the taxpayers, not through their taxes, but through their funds for retirement. That money then goes towards testing if the idea is valid and viable, but then creating a commercial version of it, because a laboratory version is basically tinker toys compared to what the commercial version needs to be. It needs to be foolproof. It needs to have instructions. It needs to do the work that I would normally have to do to teach another laboratory, but all in a single, simple package. When the VCs step in, they bring a level of company maturity and then the funds and the ability to find professional company managers to do it for you.